Hello, history lovers, Eleanor here. Tonight we will embark on a journey that begins in a city cradled by the sea, Venice. But not the Venice of glossy postcards and sun-dappled canals. No, we're stepping into a version of Venice that breathed through masks, whispered through alleyways, and painted shadows on its walls. The Venice of the plague years. Imagine an early morning fog drifting in over the lagoon, thick and pale like milk. Wooden boats creaking against stone docks, the soft toll of a church bell carried by damp air. Somewhere a cat leaps from a rooftop, and behind closed shutters someone coughs. Venice, magnificent and fragile, was no stranger to disease. In the 15th century, waves of plague lapped at its foundations like tides, and in this fragile moment, a man stepped forward not with sword or scripture, but with brush and pigment. That man was Gentile Bellini, a painter whose legacy, though obscured by time, captured a world trying desperately to survive. If you enjoy these journeys through time, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. And if you have a favorite historical tale, whether it's grand or humble, I'd love to hear it in the comments. Now, settle in comfortably, close your eyes, and let's travel back in time with Eleanor. The first time I read Gentile Bellini's name, I was barely older than my granddaughter is now. It was scribbled in the margin of an art history book at the public library. Gentile, Giovanni? A student's musing, I suppose. Most people remember Giovanni Bellini, the more famous brother, the one who revolutionized Venetian color and light. But Gentile, he was the one who ventured where others wouldn't, into courts, into cities of plague, into forgotten corners of human experience. He was born in 1429, into a family where pigment ran in the blood. His father, Jacopo Bellini, was already a renowned painter, and their workshop was a vibrant place, a swirl of apprentices, fresco sketches, wooden panels, and prayers muttered under breaths. Gentile learned to mix ochres before he could write letters. He saw colors not just as hues, but as emotion. Venice at this time was a city both glittering and vulnerable. Trade brought silk, spice, and stories, but also disease. As early as 1348, the Black Death had reduced the population by nearly 60%, and though a century had passed, the scars remained. Quarantine islands, mass graves, and still the city painted. It celebrated art with a devotion that verged on religious. Churches commissioned altarpieces, palaces displayed mythological scenes. And the Bellini family? They were at the center of it all. Gentile's early works were devout, structured, almost delicate. One critic once described them as having an architect's clarity. He painted saints who looked more like judges, and Madonnas who seemed to be listening, really listening, to the prayers of the poor. His paintings had a certain stillness, a quiet dignity. But what fascinated me, even back then, was the way he saw the city. One of his most well-known works, The Procession in St. Mark's Square, isn't just a religious painting. It's a portrait of Venice itself. The cobblestones shimmer under golden light. The architecture arches with precision. But look closer, and you'll see tiny stories unfolding. A man wiping his brow, a child reaching for his mother's veil, an old merchant leaning too far on his cane. This wasn't just art, it was record-keeping of the soul. There's a temptation, I think, to romanticize Renaissance Venice. The gondolas, the carnival masks, the Byzantine mosaics. But as I sit here, tea cooling beside me, cat asleep on my lap, I can't help but wonder, what did it feel like to walk those narrow lanes, knowing that the next outbreak might already be growing in someone's lungs? What kind of courage did it take to keep painting? In Gentile's time, Venice had already institutionalized the lazarettos, quarantine stations on outlying islands. Ships arriving in port were required to wait 40 days, 40 giorni, hence the term quarantine, before passengers could disembark. It was a marvel of public health, centuries ahead of its time. But still the plague returned again and again, and with it came silence, deserted piazzas, the smell of vinegar-soaked cloth, processions of masked doctors and desperate prayers. And yet, in this space of uncertainty, Gentile painted. He painted not with the frenzy of fear, but with the intimacy of witness. One has to wonder, did he know what it meant to preserve a moment, to resist the erasure that time and disease threatened to impose? Perhaps that's why I always felt drawn to him, even before I knew his name well. Because Gentile Bellini didn't just document beauty, he honored survival. There's a quiet irony in how time has treated him. Despite being appointed official portraitist to the Doges of Venice, despite being sent as a cultural ambassador to the Ottoman court, despite being commissioned to capture the very soul of his city, his name has all but faded into the footnotes. But not for us. Not tonight. Gentile Bellini may have been born into art, but he was shaped by something deeper, the rhythms of a city always on the edge of mourning and magnificence. I often imagine his childhood in his father Jacopo's workshop. It wasn't a quiet place, I suspect. Apprentices mixing pigments, the scrape of charcoal on parchment, someone shouting from the street below about fresh figs or yesterday's gossip. But amidst this controlled chaos, Gentile grew into a precise observer. He didn't only learn how to paint, he learned how to see. Jacopo was no ordinary father. He had studied in Florence, perhaps even brushed shoulders with Donatello and Masaccio. He brought back notebooks filled with strange ideas about perspective, then new and dazzling. In those sketchbooks, arches bent, streets vanished toward invisible points, and figures breathed space. To young Gentile, this must have seemed like sorcery. And yet, there was discipline too. Venetian painting was not wild like the Florentine school. It was structured, deliberate, almost ceremonial. Every detail had to serve both beauty and balance. Jacopo trained both his sons, Gentile and Giovanni, with this in mind. But even then their differences emerged. Gentile was the more formal, more civic-minded. He painted processions and ceremonies, monumental events frozen in time. Giovanni, in contrast, embraced mood and color, the trembling light of sunsets and saints. As the years went on, Giovanni became the master of intimacy. But Gentile? He painted society itself. In 1474, Gentile was appointed the official painter to the Republic of Venice, an honor not lightly given. His task was clear: record the great events of the city with the seriousness of a historian and the clarity of a mirror. And Venice had plenty to record: ambassadors, processions, miracles, tragedies. One of his most famous works, the Procession of the True Cross in Piazza San Marco, was commissioned by the Scuola Grande di San Giovanni Evangelista. The painting depicts a real event, a religious procession during which a miraculous healing took place, but Gentile doesn't focus on the miracle. No, he paints the crowd. That's the part that always gives me chills. He captures, in painstaking detail, a sea of humanity. Nobles in their finery, barefoot children darting through the crowd, elderly men leaning on staffs, sailors with sun-darkened skin. The architecture gleams, the movement feels real. And somewhere in the crowd, a man kneels, his child supposedly healed. But Gentile lets the viewer find him, almost by accident. He trusted us to look closer. It reminds me of walking into my old classroom after a snowstorm, chalk dust still lingering in the air, scarves hanging over radiator pipes. I'd take attendance and someone would always ask, "Are we doing anything important today, Mrs. Wren?" And I'd smile and say, only the same thing Bellini did, paying attention. In the 1470s, Venice was still recovering from another bout of plague. It had hit the poor the hardest, as it often did, and left a strange silence over parts of the city. Bells tolled less frequently, as if the grief had become too heavy to name. And yet Gentile kept painting, documenting. He once painted the healing of a possessed man, and though the title sounds sensational, the image is startlingly grounded. The scene takes place in front of the Scuola di San Giovanni Evangelista, not some imaginary biblical landscape. The crowd watches with restraint, the buildings loom familiar, and the possessed man is rendered with both pathos and ambiguity. Was he truly healed, or was he simply seen? This painting, too, makes me pause, because even in a moment that could have lent itself to the mystical, Gentile grounded his work in observation. His miracles are civic, his saints walk on Venetian stone. Historians sometimes say Gentile was too literal, that his brother surpassed him in emotional depth. But I wonder, can clarity be its own emotion? To render a street scene so meticulously, to line each cobble, to frame each face, isn't that a form of devotion? Isn't that its own kind of tenderness? I once stood before one of his paintings in a quiet gallery in Venice. The tourists had drifted away, the afternoon light slanted across the floor, and there it was, a face in the crowd, painted over 500 years ago. A man I'll never know, frozen mid-breath, mid-blink. Not a king, not a saint, just there. And I whispered, "I see you." Sometimes I wonder how many people Gentile saved from forgetting, not through miracles, but through brushstrokes. Even the does, those powerful, bejeweled leaders of Venice, sat for him. But he didn't flatter them. He painted their age, their gravity, their strange blend of authority and exhaustion. His portrait of Doge Giovanni Mocenigo shows a man not triumphant but watchful, a leader who knows too well what shadows lie in alleyways. What would it have felt like, I wonder, to paint the most powerful man in the Republic and still insist on truth? This makes us wonder if art at its best doesn't comfort the powerful, but confronts them gently, quietly, with a reflection they can't look away from. Gentile's portraits, his processions, his architectural backdrops, they're all about stillness, but not emptiness. Stillness as presence, stillness as witness, and that, perhaps, is why his work remains, because he gave history a face. It was the year 1479 when Gentile Bellini left the foggy canals of Venice and stepped onto a path few Christian artists of his stature had ever taken. The Venetian Republic, always a shrewd player in the East-West political game, had struck a new peace treaty with the Ottoman Empire. As a gesture of diplomacy, they decided to send something more potent than gold or ships. They sent a painter, and not just any painter. They sent Gentile. It still amazes me that this choice was made. Not a soldier, not a priest, a painter. Gentile was 50 years old at the time, seasoned but not slowing. He boarded a galley for Constantinople, modern-day Istanbul, carrying brushes, pigments, rolls of canvas, and something even more delicate, cultural trust. When I think about that voyage, I imagine the late summer wind off the Adriatic, the creak of rigging, the nervous silence among diplomats. Gentile, ever the observer, likely stood at the rail watching the horizon, wondering not what he would paint, but what he would be allowed to see. Upon arriving, he was greeted not with suspicion, but with curiosity. The court of Sultan Mehmed II, known in the West as the Conqueror, was a hub of intellect and artistry. Mehmed was no barbarian ruler. He spoke multiple languages, collected rare books, and had a fascination with Renaissance ideals. And he wanted his portrait painted by a Venetian master. This moment, so easily lost in textbooks, still sends a shiver down my spine. A Christian painter in the court of a Muslim emperor. No war, no sermon, just pigment, canvas, and dignified exchange. And Gentile? He didn't flinch. The resulting portrait, though only known through copies and descriptions, was revolutionary. Mehmed is shown in profile, a laurel crown resting lightly on his turban, with a serene, almost melancholic expression. Gone are the harsh lines of medieval caricature. In their place, humanity. One contemporary noted that Gentile softened Mehmed's features in a way that scandalized some Europeans. Too flattering, they said. But Gentile, I think, was painting what he saw. A powerful man, yes, but also a man of vision and weight. During his time in Constantinople, Gentile created more than a portrait. He absorbed architecture, textiles, manners, and motifs that would later echo in his work. His sketchbooks, some of which survive, include studies of Ottoman robes, domed ceilings, and even janissaries in formation. These weren't trophy sketches, they were bridges. Sometimes I think about the moment when Mehmed first saw the finished portrait. Did he nod silently? Did he speak? Did he recognize himself? And perhaps more importantly, did he feel seen, in the same way Gentile saw the crowds in Venice? Historians still debate whether Mehmed commissioned more works from Gentile. Some say there were additional portraits. Others suggest that cultural tensions may have limited the scope of what could be exchanged. After all, visual representation, especially of rulers, was treated quite differently in Islamic traditions. But what cannot be denied is this: Gentile brought something back with him. Not only sketches and gifts, but a new way of seeing. When he returned to Venice, he presented Sultan Mehmed's portrait to the Doge. The gesture was political, yes, but it was also artistic diplomacy in its purest form. And in the years that followed, Venetian art began to reflect the East in quiet, intricate ways: curved arches, gold filigree, the soft layering of silk over skin. I often tell my students, well, when I used to teach full-time, that empires communicate in symbols, and painters like Gentile were their translators. Not spies, not flatterers, translators. Gentile once gifted a Christian icon to the Sultan, painted by his own hand. It was unusual, even risky, but Mehmed accepted it, reportedly with reverence. This small exchange, barely footnoted in most books, makes me pause. Because what does it say about both men? Perhaps that art speaks even when language fails. Perhaps that recognition is more powerful than representation. And perhaps that being remembered, not as a conqueror, not as a foreigner, but as a man with a face and name, is the closest thing we have to peace. Later in life, Gentile would paint again with a renewed delicacy. Scholars note a subtle shift in his palette: softer shadows, richer fabrics, a greater sense of cultural layering. Whether this came from his Eastern travels or his own aging heart, we may never know. But I like to think that Constantinople left an imprint on him, not just as a painter, but as a human being. I remember the first time I saw a reproduction of the Mehmed portrait. I was in my 20s, visiting a small exhibit in Florence. The lighting was poor, and the frame was cracked, but I stood there for almost 20 minutes. Because there, in a foreign king's eyes, I saw something unspoken. Not power, not conquest, but a kind of shared stillness. The kind Gentile always knew how to capture. And so, in that single voyage eastward, Gentile didn't just cross a sea. He crossed the boundaries of identity and proved that a brush could be braver than a blade. When Gentile returned from Constantinople, he did not ride in triumph or seek applause. He came on with quiet purpose, returning to the familiar studios and shaded alleyways of Venice. But something in his eyes, I imagine, had changed. Once a chronicler of processions and saints, he now brought with him the echoes of a foreign court, and with them a deeper sense of human complexity. And yet, even after painting emperors, Gentile returned to what he did best, capturing the ordinary within the extraordinary. And nowhere was this more evident than in his portraits. You see, Gentile Bellini had a gift that separated him from many of his contemporaries. While others idealized their subjects, he observed them. His portraits weren't meant to flatter, but to reveal. He painted doges not as statues of state, but as aging men burdened by duty. He captured scholars mid-thought, their fingers slightly ink-stained, their robes wrinkled with use. There was no grandeur for grandeur's sake, only truth, gently revealed. Take, for instance, his portrait of Caterina Cornaro, the last queen of Cyprus. The painting shows a noblewoman not in youth's prime, but in her later years, still regal, still commanding, yet softened by time. Her eyes don't pierce, they ponder, and for a woman who had been both monarch and political pawn, Gentile paints not the crown, but the consequence of having worn one. This subtle approach was especially remarkable considering the period. The late 15th century was an era of symbolic flourishes, scepters, laurel wreaths, gilded thrones. Painters often drowned their sitters in allegory, but Gentile? He leaned in close, as if to say, forget the costume. Who are you, beneath it all? Even more fascinating are the quiet touches, he added. Small dogs resting at a sitter's feet, a worn book clutched too tightly, a gaze that avoids the viewer. These were not props, they were confessions. I often think of Gentile's work as historical whispering. You have to lean in, be still, and truly look. The stories aren't shouted, they're gently folded into folds of cloth and shadows on the wall. It's in these portraits that we begin to see the faint presence of something else, something almost taboo in Venetian art at the time, illness. Not depicted directly, of course. This was still an era when physical deformity or visible suffering was considered unsuitable for high commissions. But Gentile, who had returned from a world where plagues were spoken of with reverence and fear, began to hint at it. Look closely, and you'll notice sitters with skin a little too pale, cheeks hollowed slightly more than beauty would demand. There's a man whose left hand curls oddly, perhaps from a healed fracture or paralysis. A woman whose neck is wrapped just a little too tightly in lace, possibly concealing something she hopes the painter wouldn't include. But Gentile did. He didn't announce it, but he preserved it. This was Venice, after all, a city built on salt water and vulnerability. By the time Gentile reached his later years, the memory of the plague was never far. Even during times of prosperity, fear lingered in the corners of markets and chapels. Bells that once rang for weddings now chimed for funerals. And masks, yes, the infamous beaked masks of the plague doctors, became as familiar as crucifixes. Those masks, with their curved beaks filled with herbs and spices, were meant to purify the air, to protect the physician from miasma, the bad air believed to carry disease. And though they were grotesque, they became symbols of a city that refused to stop breathing. Gentile never painted a plague doctor outright, that we know, but the symbolism crept into his work nonetheless. In one of his lesser-known pieces, the procession in the piazza of the Scuola di San Marco, the crowd parts gently, allowing a procession of clergy to pass. But if you look in the corner, there's a figure in dark robes, face obscured, standing just beyond the crowd, watching. Too shadowed to be noble, too still to be a participant. Many believe it to be a nod, subtle but unmistakable, to the city's other procession, the one that came for the sick. It's moments like these that give his paintings a second life. You see one story at first glance, but stay a while, and another one emerges. As I think about this today, sitting in my little reading room, watching twilight stretch long across the rug, I can't help but feel how timeless these visual codes are. Even now, in times of modern illness and uncertainty, we've learned to read the world differently. A mask means care. A crowd means risk. A hand clasped to the chest might mean something more. And yet Gentile was already speaking to us about this, through painted processions, through portraits of quiet frailty, through choices that most viewers missed, but that history eventually remembered. I sometimes imagine what it was like for him to set up his easel, preparing a canvas not for myth or martyrdom, but for truth. Not a grand truth, but a human one, that we are fragile, that even the powerful are touched by time, that the most enduring portraits are not of the strongest, but of the most authentic. And when he painted, I believe Gentile was asking us not to look away. Even now, all these centuries later, I find myself leaning toward his work, not for answers, but for recognition. Because in his patient brushstrokes, there's something profoundly comforting. The idea that we have always been vulnerable, and that we have always made beauty anyway. As we continue to trace Gentile Bellini's footsteps through the shifting light of late 15th century Venice, a darker motif begins to settle like dust across the canvas. The plague, that silent, invisible force that haunted his lifetime and reshaped every inch of the city he called home. By the time Gentile was in his 60s, Venice had endured several major outbreaks of bubonic plague. Each one arrived like a thief in the night. No trumpets, no warnings, just a cough, then a fever, and then, before anyone could process it, entire neighborhoods emptied. Windows were shuttered, markets silenced, and gondolas carried more bodies than passengers. And yet, despite all of this, few artists dared to paint it. The plague was not considered appropriate subject matter for most commissions. It was too raw, too terrifying. Who would hang such a scene in their home? Who would pray beside it in a chapel? Painters focused on redemptions, martyrdoms, miracles, things that uplifted, not unsettled. But Gentile? He never followed fashion, and though most of his publicly known work remains formal, reverent, and composed, there are whispers of something more. There's a painting that's often spoken of in hushed tones by historians. It has no official title and no confirmed location. Some call it the Lament of the Quarantine. Others simply refer to it as the Lost Bellini. We know of it only through a few fragmentary journal entries, an engraving said to be inspired by the original, and the oral traditions of Venetian families, who swear their ancestors once glimpsed it. According to these scattered records, the painting depicted a scene outside the gates of a lazaretto, a quarantine island where suspected plague victims were sent. There, among sparse trees and low stone walls, were men and women waiting, not dying, not healing, just waiting. Their faces were gaunt, their clothes were stained. A mother holds her child, not with hope, but with resignation. A young man, alone, stares toward the water, as if calculating how far he'd need to swim to escape. And in the far left corner, almost easy to miss, a figure in black leans against the wall. Some say it was a plague doctor. Others think it was a self-portrait. There's no way to prove this painting ever existed, but I believe it did. Why? Because Gentile had seen that liminal space. The place between illness and health, fear and hope, and he was too curious, too compassionate not to record it. Not for money, not for fame, but because someone had to. In a city so obsessed with surfaces, shining marble, golden mosaics, mirrored salons, Gentile chose to look beneath, to witness not the triumph over disease, but the endurance through it. And perhaps I think that's why the painting vanished. Venice, for all its resilience, preferred to forget. After each plague, the city rebuilt quickly, celebrating survival with music, pageantry, and even a massive church, Il Redentore, erected after the 1575 outbreak. Public memory was short, on purpose, and a painting like Gentile's, with its stark reminder of shared vulnerability, may have been quietly taken down, stored away, or even destroyed. Still, remnants remain. A charcoal sketch in the Accademia bears a striking resemblance to the supposed layout of the lost painting. There's a copyist's engraving from 1520 titled "On the Island of Waiting," attributed only to after GB. And then, of course, there are stories passed down through families like relics. Your great-grandfather once saw the painting of the waiting souls, they say. He never forgot it. Neither do I. Even as a child, I remember sitting at my grandmother's feet as she described the plague of 1918. Her voice dropped just like mine does now as she recalled neighbors falling ill overnight, entire streets turning quiet. It was like a bell had been struck and no one knew who it tolled for next, she whispered. And I think Gentile knew that sound too. He didn't paint it with skulls or allegorical demons. He painted humans, waiting together in silence. That was his language. Historians still debate whether the painting, if it existed, was ever meant to be seen by the public. Was it a personal act of mourning, a visual diary entry, a gift never delivered? This makes us wonder if some of the most powerful art is not created for crowds, but for closure, a painter's quiet prayer, a way to carry what cannot be spoken. In our modern world, we often measure legacy by what survives, the paintings hanging in galleries, the names etched into plaques. But what of the things that vanish? The stories passed hand to hand, like folded notes in a classroom. Do they matter less? I don't think so. Gentile's lost painting, if it ever hung, may be gone, but its shadow remains, in the way we speak of illness, in the caution with which we remember certain years, in the faces we still pass on the street and wonder, quietly, what they've endured. And so I tell his story, not because it has a perfect ending, but because even in absence something lingers, a brushstroke, a silence, a waiting figure in the corner of a forgotten painting. Sometimes that's all it takes to keep history breathing. By the dawn of the 16th century, Gentile Bellini's name was still one spoken with respect in Venice's winding streets and candlelit salons. He was called Maestro, though whispers of his younger brother Giovanni's rising stardom had begun to drift like smoke through the alleys. It's not that Gentile was forgotten, no, not yet, but a shadow had begun to form, slowly dimming the edges of his once illuminated reputation. It happens sometimes, doesn't it? History, like a theater spotlight, decides where to cast its glow. And Gentile, the civic recorder, the ambassador painter, the silent witness to plague and ceremony alike, found himself standing just outside the beam. His younger brother Giovanni Bellini was by then revolutionizing Venetian painting with his use of oil, light, and color. While Gentile painted the faces of the city, Giovanni captured its moods: sunset warmth, damp garden quiet, the hush of a saint's gaze. Patrons turned their heads, the brushwork was softer, the emotion more lyrical. And slowly, Gentile's clarity began to look old-fashioned. That word, old-fashioned, has always rubbed me the wrong way. Art doesn't age, not really. The brush may dry, the canvas may darken, but meaning doesn't wrinkle. What Gentile gave Venice wasn't decorative, it was documentary, and it requires more than a glance. It demands presence, time. But the city changed, its appetite shifted. Where once they craved a historian's brush, they now wanted a poet's. And Gentile, faithful to the line, to architecture, to balanced truth, kept painting in his way, deliberate, precise, measured. He accepted fewer commissions, perhaps by choice, perhaps by drift. The grand processions he once orchestrated with dozens of figures gave way to quieter works. His portraits became more intimate, his scenes more reflective. And yet, he never complained. There is a small anecdote, one of my favorites in fact, that comes from the workshop he shared with Giovanni. As the story goes, Gentile was working on a panel depicting Saint Mark preaching in Alexandria. The scale was massive, the composition crowded with foreign faces and strange beasts, inspired by his time in the East. It was his masterpiece in progress, meant to crown his career. But age had begun to slow him. His hands were steady, but his eyes tired more quickly. One afternoon, as he laid down his brush for the day, he turned to Giovanni and said something extraordinary. "If I do not finish this, I want you to. Promise me." And Giovanni did. Can you imagine the humility in that moment? To ask your younger sibling, the one praised more loudly, the one whose style had stolen the crowd's affection, to complete the work of your lifetime. But Gentile knew something we often forget. Legacy is not ownership, it's continuation. And so when Gentile died in 1507, at the age of 78, the painting of Saint Mark was not complete. Giovanni, true to his word, finished it. The two brothers, so different in voice, blended together on that canvas, one last conversation in paint. The piece now hangs in the Accademia Gallery in Venice. When you stand before it, you can feel the difference in brushstroke halfway through. Gentile's side is crisp, orderly, carefully composed. Giovanni's is looser, softer, filled with air and feeling. Yet they don't clash, they converse. And isn't that beautiful? To be continued, not in imitation, but in dialogue. Still, history would soon favor Giovanni. Art treatises praised his mastery of oil. Young painters studied his Madonna faces, his luminous skies. Meanwhile, Gentile's name faded quietly into footnotes and plaques, always the older brother, rarely the master. Even Vasari, the great chronicler of Renaissance artists, gave Gentile a polite nod and quickly moved on. It breaks my heart a little, I'll admit, to see someone who gave so much to their city, who painted its rituals, honored its faces, chronicled its grief, reduced to a marginal figure. But perhaps Gentile didn't mind. His work was never about being seen. It was about seeing others. And those he painted, those crowds in piazzas, those sick and waiting souls, those forgotten officials and quiet queens, they remember. As I leaf through an old exhibition catalogue here on my desk, I pause at a black and white reproduction of the procession in St. Mark's Square. The faces are blurred with time, but the energy remains. Each figure still moves forward, step by step, under the golden arches. And in the bottom right corner, among the crowd, is a man with a sketchbook. He doesn't look up, he just watches. And I know it's him. That, perhaps, is the quiet triumph of Gentile Bellini. He didn't demand history's attention. He simply paid attention to history. And long after the crowd has turned toward newer names and brighter pigments, his work remains, waiting for us to look back. The funny thing about being forgotten is how often you're not truly gone, just tucked away in places where people have stopped looking. That's how it is with Gentile Bellini. His name may not command the instant recognition of a Da Vinci or a Michelangelo. You won't see it etched into coffee mugs in museum gift shops. But step into the right archive, turn the right corner in Venice, and there he is, watching still. In recent decades, art historians have begun to circle back, pulling his name from the margins and dusting off the canvases he left behind. And as they do, something remarkable has begun to happen. We're seeing Gentile not just as the older Bellini, not just as the official painter of the Republic, but as a visionary, one who painted illness, diplomacy, and diversity at a time when most painters stayed comfortably within religious scenes and local saints. You see, for centuries, Gentile was catalogued as the formal one, the recorder, the documentarian. His processions and portraits were seen as technically brilliant, but emotionally distant. But in the age of rediscovery, our age, that restraint is being read differently, no longer as coldness, but as reverence. Take the renewed interest in the procession in Piazza San Marco. For years, it was considered a beautiful but static depiction of a religious event. But now scholars are re-examining it for what it truly was, a moment of mass emotion, carefully composed to capture the psychological temperature of a city in motion. Art students today are asked to zoom in on the tiny expressions: astonishment, weariness, piety, even boredom. Gentile didn't just paint what was there, he painted what was felt. And perhaps no moment better reflects this shifting understanding than the quiet return of Gentile to modern exhibitions. A few years ago, a small show at the Scuola di San Giovanni Evangelista included a side gallery titled Faces in the Crowd. It featured fragments and reproductions of Gentile's minor figures, people barely noticeable in his grand compositions, a merchant shading his eyes, a boy tugging his father's sleeve, a woman whose face turns away from the viewer. I went. I stood before a modest charcoal sketch of a veiled woman with tired eyes, and I felt like I had met someone real. Not a muse, not a myth, a neighbor. One of my favorite stories to tell my students, when I used to teach Renaissance art in the evenings at the community college, was about the rediscovery of a minor Bellini piece tucked away in a storeroom in Treviso. For decades, it had been misattributed or simply ignored. A humble panel painting, no more than 2 feet wide, depicting a man seated on a bench beside a canal, reading. That's it. No miracle, no procession, just solitude. But the light, oh, the light in that painting. It falls like a whisper across the man's shoulders, illuminating just the curve of the book's pages. The artist hadn't signed it, but the handwriting, so to speak, was unmistakable. When it was finally authenticated as Gentile's, the room where it was kept was quietly renamed the Bellini study room. It makes me wonder how many other small, quiet works lie unlabeled, hidden behind noise and fame. And it reminds me, gentle legacies are the hardest to trace. They don't shout, they don't leave monuments, they simply soften us, one viewer at a time. Gentile's influence, as we now understand, runs deeper than brushstroke. He pioneered the visual recording of public life. He brought Eastern aesthetics into Western religious art, without reducing them to novelty. He made stillness powerful, at a time when motion and drama ruled the scene. And while his brother Giovanni helped birth the high Renaissance style in Venice, it was Gentile who laid the foundations, brick by brick, painting by painting. There's an essay I love by a modern Venetian art critic who wrote, "Giovanni Bellini painted how the world might be, Gentile painted how it truly was." And isn't that, in the end, the higher compliment? Even today, in our camera-saturated age, we crave that kind of honesty. We don't just want beautiful images, we want to see ourselves reflected in them, our uncertainty, our waiting, our quiet dignity. Historians still debate whether Gentile's method, rigid perspective, civic precision, limited his artistic freedom. Some argue that he never truly broke free, never reached the heights his brother did in terms of spiritual abstraction. But I'm not so sure. Because breaking free isn't always about abandoning form. Sometimes it's about choosing to stay faithful to what matters, even when the crowd moves on. And Gentile, he stayed. He stayed with the people, with the processions, with the weary faces behind the gold mosaics. He painted what he saw, and he believed that was enough. And all these centuries later, as we begin to look again, it still is. I've always found it remarkable how some names echo quietly through time, not loudly, not insistently, but steadily, like the lapping of water against stone. Gentile Bellini is one of those names, and recently, His quiet voice has found its way into the hands and eyes of modern creators and thinkers in ways I think even he wouldn't have imagined. In the world of medical humanities, a field that blends art, ethics, and health, Gentile's subtle portrayals of illness and waiting have begun to surface in discussions about how we depict suffering, not as spectacle, but as shared human experience. One particular scholar, an oncologist with a passion for Renaissance art, wrote an article titled "The Gaze in the Lazaretto, Learning from Bellini." He described how Gentile's rumored lost plague painting, The Lament of the Quarantine, though unseen, had helped him reimagine his role as a caregiver. To wait with patients, not just for them, to hold presence in silence. Isn't that astounding? A painter gone for over 5 centuries, still teaching empathy. Gentile's influence has also crept into modern visual storytelling. Filmmakers studying the composition of crowd scenes often cite Bellini's processions, the way he layered motion into stillness, the way every figure, no matter how small, seemed to carry a narrative. I once attended a small panel discussion at a film school where a student director described how she'd storyboarded a refugee scene by referencing the procession in Piazza San Marco. "I didn't want panic," she said. "I wanted recognition. That's what Bellini does. He shows you people before he shows you drama." That made me smile. Recognition over spectacle. A lesson for all of us. Even in photography, particularly during the height of the recent global pandemic, Gentile's sensibility seemed to flicker through. I remember scrolling through a series of photo essays that captured masked faces waiting in hospital corridors or standing silently in grocery lines. The lighting, the solemnity, the honest stillness, it all felt so familiar, like a Bellini. And in academic circles, too, his name is being gently recentered. University courses now pair his works with broader discussions on public health imagery, how cities show themselves in times of crisis, and what kinds of stories get told. He's becoming a case study in visual restraint, in intimacy without intrusion. Sometimes, his name appears unexpectedly. In a footnote of a novel about memory loss, a character compares her father's fading expressions to the soft faces in Bellini's Lost Crowd. In a podcast episode on Islamic Christian diplomacy, Gentile is referenced as a rare example of peace painted, not signed. It's happening slowly, but it's happening. This makes us wonder, how many legacies are simply waiting for the right moment to resurface? How many artists, thinkers, and witnesses have been paused mid-sentence by time itself? And what role do we play in finishing that sentence? One of the more touching modern tributes to Gentile came from a young painter who recreated one of his crowd scenes using only silhouettes. No faces, just outlines. She called it The Ones He Saw. When asked why, she said, because he saw everyone, even the ones no one else painted. I sat with that for a long time, because that, I think, is the heartbeat of Gentile Bellini's work. He saw everyone. He didn't spotlight heroes. He spotlighted humanity, the overlooked, the silent, the waiting. And perhaps that's why his influence lingers, not in museums alone, but in conversations, in the ways we look at one another, the ways we remember to pause, to notice, to witness. I sometimes think of what Gentile would say if he knew how his work is being rediscovered. Would he smile, quietly, and return to his brush? Would he wave it off, saying he was merely doing his duty as a Venetian? Or would he simply nod, knowing that he had left something behind, not in marble or proclamation, but in the quiet habit of observation? After all, the greatest legacy isn't the painting itself. It's the way it teaches others to see. And today, more and more eyes are turning back toward his gentle compositions, his silent figures, his careful renderings of fragile lives, not to marvel at grandeur, but to feel close to something. That closeness, I think, is the soul of his work. And now, finally, the world seems ready to lean in. Throughout this journey we've taken with Gentile Bellini, I've returned again and again to one haunting question. What does it mean to be remembered? Not in fame, not in fortune, but in feeling, in fragments, in the ripple you leave behind long after the crowd has moved on. That question settled into my heart more deeply than ever during the quiet months of the pandemic. Like so many others, I found myself turning to old comforts, worn books, the scent of tea, sunlight on wallpaper, and in one of those long afternoons, I found myself really staring at a reproduction of Gentile's St. Mark preaching in Alexandria. Now I've seen that painting hundreds of times, taught it, written about it, hundreds of them, packed into the scene. Some turn toward the preacher, others seem distracted. One man glances at the viewer, a woman half-veiled cradles a child. There's a merchant, an elderly scribe, even a boy clutching the folds of someone's robe. It's a sea of listening, of wondering, of being present. And I realized something then, something I think Gentile must have understood in his bones, that moments of togetherness, especially in times of uncertainty, are more sacred than any cathedral. He painted not just events, but collective breath. When I walk through modern cities now, I sometimes try to see them through his eyes. The quiet grace of commuters at a bus stop, a teenager waiting alone outside a pharmacy, an elderly couple feeding pigeons without speaking. We move through our own processions every day, and Gentile would have painted them all. In recent years, as our global experience has been marked by illness, isolation, and cautious reconnection, his vision feels more relevant than ever. He understood the strange, unspoken poetry of waiting, the space between crisis and resolution. In fact, several contemporary artists have cited him directly when exploring pandemic themes. One ceramicist in Florence created a series of porcelain masks inspired by Bellini's rumored plague doctor figures. Another painter in Istanbul crafted a sprawling mural of masked faces watching a modern-day procession through a city square, titled simply, Gentile's Crowd. Even the medical field has found space for him. A hospital in Milan recently displayed a poster series about human-centered care, using cropped images from Bellini's processional works. The tagline read, "Healing begins with being seen." Isn't that what Gentile always gave us? Not cures, not answers, presence. He didn't offer redemption through miracles or grand gestures. He offered redemption through attention, through the radical act of not looking away. And it makes me wonder, how often do we do that now? In our fast scroll culture, our need for spectacle, our addiction to instant reward, how often do we truly see the world in front of us? Gentile's work asks us to slow down, to let our gaze linger, to notice the man behind the merchant's stall, the woman in the last pew, the child whose story hasn't yet begun. Even today, I carry that invitation with me. When I'm at the market and I see an old man carefully selecting pears, I think of Gentile. When I ride the tram and catch a young woman's tired reflection in the glass, I think of Gentile. And when I'm standing in line at the pharmacy, masked like everyone else, with only our eyes to speak, I think of Gentile, because he would have painted us too. Not as heroes, not as villains, but as witnesses to our own time. Historians still debate whether Gentile's real gift was his brushwork or his vision, but I no longer care to separate the two, because in his hands, the brush didn't just record, it honored. It honored the living, the waiting, the forgotten. It honored what it means to be human. And in our own time of masks and distance and cautious hope, I think we've begun to understand that more deeply than ever. So if you ever find yourself in Venice, and you walk into a gallery or chapel, and see a painting dense with faces, don't rush past. Stand still, look closely, and say softly, "I see you." Because in that moment, Gentile Bellini's legacy lives on, not in marble, not in history books, but in the space between two people who notice each other. And so, we arrive at the quiet close of Gentile Bellini's story, not with a dramatic flourish, but with a gentle hush of closing doors at dusk, the final strokes on a canvas drying slowly in a still late daylight. He passed away in 1507, at 78 years old, a long life by the standards of his time. He died not with grandeur, but with grace, surrounded by the work of his hands and, I like to believe, the quiet knowledge that he had witnessed well. There was no grand public mourning, no vast funerary monument, no marble tomb with angels weeping. His funeral, from what records suggest, was modest, the kind of farewell one might expect for a craftsman, not a celebrity. But that is fitting. Gentile was never a man for noise. He was buried at Seobane e Paolo, alongside many of Venice's artists and leaders. I visited that church. It's vast, echoing, filled with light from high windows and the murmurs of passing tourists. But if you walk quietly along the side chapels and pause long enough, you can almost feel the city breathing around you. It's the kind of place Gentile would have loved, not because of the grandeur, but because of the people who pass through unnoticed. And now, centuries later, his story returns to us, in small exhibits, in whispered admiration from young artists, in essays, in lectures, in curious museum-goers who pause, furrow their brows, and lean in just a little closer to the details in his crowd scenes. There is something deeply healing in that, not just for Gentile, but for us, because we too live in an age marked by great shifts, by global sickness, by recovery, by questions of legacy and remembrance, and in all of that, and that's what he continues to give if we're willing to look. His art teaches us to observe slowly, to hold complexity, to notice the unnoticed. And perhaps most tenderly, it teaches us that not all influence roars. Some influence rests, quietly, like dust on a beloved windowsill, catching the light only when the sun moves just right. I think often of the painting his brother Giovanni finished after Gentile's death, St. Mark preaching in Alexandria, a masterpiece shared by two hands, two minds, two hearts. But it was Gentile who began it, who saw the composition in his mind's eye, who laid the foundations. And perhaps that's the perfect metaphor for his place in history. He was the one who built the stage, who placed the light, who arranged the scene, so others could step forward. And even if his name faded for a time, his influence never did. Tonight, as I sit by my lamp, tea cooling beside me, I picture him, a man standing before an empty canvas, brush in hand, eyes soft and alert, not looking for glory, just looking, truly looking. Perhaps that's how we should all strive to live, not to leave behind noise, but to leave behind witness, to see and be seen, to love the ordinary, to hold space for the fragile, the waiting, the forgotten. Because in the end, history doesn't just belong to kings and cathedrals. It belongs to the painter who sketched a waiting crowd, to the brother who asked to be remembered through honesty, not grandeur, to the faces that still gaze quietly from his work centuries later, inviting us to pause and stay a while. So now, dear listener, as the night deepens and the world grows quiet, I invite you to carry Gentile's gentle legacy with you. Let your eyes linger a little longer on the people around you. Listen to the quiet moments between conversations. Notice the shape of hands, the curve of shoulders at rest, the breath shared in silence. History lives there too, in the small, the tender, the overlooked. As you drift into sleep, may you feel the hush of ancient Venice wrapping softly around you, the echo of sandals on stone, the rustle of fabric in a crowded piazza, the steady hand of a painter, capturing not perfection, but presence. May you dream not of battles or kings, but of crowded streets bathed in golden light, where each figure matters, each story counts, and nothing is too small to be remembered. And when you wake, may you carry that quiet attention with you, because